Marriage is more than constant bliss or unending sacrifice.
It's exploring your own story and seeing the other for who they are, even as they change.
It's the discovery of life in the gaps and the mysteries that emerge when we believe that fullness is possible for each other.
Marriage is choosing the other's flourishing on a daily basis to build a relationship that thrives and reflects the kingdom of God.
Choosing Us, a 4-week series on marriage that will introduce you to each of our campus pastors and their spouses,
will remind us all that we cannot do God's work in the world without being bound to one another.
We must choose one another
Again and again.
we must choose God.
Again and again.
We must learn who we are
And who the other is in our midst.
So today is a pretty fun message.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah,
We'll see.
I hope so. It's the first conversation message that you and I have had together. You've preached before, but we've never had.
I've been looking forward to one like this.
Yeah.
It's
pretty
interesting
fun
to me.
We met on a mission trip to Romania
Yeah, it was
when
like
we were in college.
20-ish.
You don't have to say
Nothing.
that.
Nothing.
No, I'm just kidding. And the funny thing about college is that it's like practice adulting.
Yeah.
Like you're not living with your parents anymore, but you're not really really on your own.
Yeah.
And so us meeting in college, like we're starting to figure out who we are as people.
Yeah, what does it mean to
as
be
adults?
But
We're also not there yet.
yeah, I was gonna say I don't think I've got that one figured
Well,
out yet.
still,
so
yeah.
working on it. But yeah, so we met because we were both involved in InterVarsity. I was at Virginia Tech, you were at East Carolina, and we went on this summer mission trip to Romania, and it was a lot of fun, right? Now, I do want to say, right, like this is for you watching. You shouldn't plan on going on a mission trip to find your spouse.
Bad idea.
Do not recommend.
No.
It worked for us, but don't do it. But yeah, that's where we met.
Yeah. So we're in a series called Choosing Us.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on a book by Gail Song Bantam and Brian Bantam of that name. And through the series, we're reminding ourselves that while marriage is important, it's not the pinnacle of life or a cornerstone of society. Like it's not the end all be all.
Yeah, despite us being told that when we were younger, right? Like, but it is one particular way in which God kind of shows us what it means to be committed to one another and to be bonded to one another. And I mean, Jesus himself wasn't married.
That's true.
Right? And a very strong argument could be made that he lived a meaningful life, right? That's a different sermon series, but
Probably.
I think it's a strong one.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it really does show us what it means to be bonded to one another, which is true in marriage and is true in other relationships within our community.
Right. Other parts of life. So this series is, or the book, Choosing Us, is really based on the story of Gail Song and her husband, Brian. And so we thought it would be fun to have this series be about our relationships, like each of the pastors with their spouse. And so Tom and Sarah are talking about choosing spiritual intimacy. Mark and Jana are talking about choosing to learn about each other.
Yeah,
And
I really hope Jana laughs a lot on the video. That'd make my heart happy.
And then we're, of course, talking about choosing partnership.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about today.
Yeah. So if nothing else, through watching these videos and hearing us, you'll get a chance to know us on a deeper level, know your pastors on a deeper level. And yeah, I'm really excited for you to walk on this journey with us. So let's get started.
Yeah. This series, Choosing Us, is part of a series of series based on the Sermon on the Mount, where we're taking topics in the Sermon on the Mount and they're inspiring our topics for our series. This one is inspired by Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32.
There's a lot of words in 35, but not 35. Chapter 5.
So here's what Jesus says.
Yeah.
You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. Okay, so Jesus is quoting the Hebrew scriptures and saying, you've heard that you can just divorce your wife by giving her a certificate and then you're done.
Pretty crappy.
Right. And he goes on to say, I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. So my hot take on this passage is that Jesus is really speaking to men and instructing them not to use their wives as objects and discard them when they're done. Like, you really need to take marriage a little bit more seriously than that. But the point of this series, the point of this message isn't really to deep dive into the meaning of those verses. Like I said, we're really telling our story and telling our story of what it's been like to be married to each other now for 18 years. And 18.
It's quite wild.
What we're learning through this series and in this message is that covenant is not necessarily a marriage, but a marriage is always a covenant. So a covenant being a vow, a promise, a sort of bond. You can have those outside of marriage, but marriage is always a covenant.
Yeah.
So let's pause here. We have a question for discussion. How was marriage modeled for you when you were growing up? Take a minute and talk about it. Put it in the chat. So when we first got married, I would say that I was complementarian, which is a word that means that I believed men and women were created equal, but with complementary God-given roles. So men were supposed to lead and women were supposed to submit or to support. And that was like how God had designed men and women. The thing is that even while I believe that, and I was desperately trying to be the good Christian wife and like do all the things the right way, I still didn't feel like we fit into the boxes that we were being given. Like there was a whole line about how men need to be respected and women need to be loved. And I just felt like, gosh darn it, like I want to be respected too. Like it just never really fit.
Well, and the flip side of that is that I also really wanted to be loved, right? Like, yes, I love being respected, but I really want to be known and loved, right? And I think that framework was a disservice to us in those early years, for sure. So you were complementarian, but I would say that I was egalitarian, which, you know, on the flip side of complementarian, believe that men and women could share equal roles within leadership in the church, and it should be more of a partnership in marriage. And I don't know that I lived that out well, but that's where I was at. However, like within our marriage, it was really convenient for me that you were complementarian and you felt like I should do more of the leading. And it just created this dynamic between us where I continued to just kind of take up more space within the partnership of us, right? Like I took up a lot more space. Which I think had some pretty rough impact on you.
Yeah. And it's not like you were a dictator or anything. Like we talked through most of our decisions, but for me, knowing that at any point you could pull the trump card and say, this is what we're going to do. It made it really difficult for me to show up to those conversations well. Like I had some like underlying resentment and bitterness, but then also struggled to be really honest about like what I really thought, because it felt risky to do that. Yeah.
And I think it was really easy for me to feel that. I think at the time we didn't have words to name that was going on, but I could feel like that it wasn't really a partnership. Right? It wasn't really us.
Now, obviously that's not how we relate to each other now.
Thank God.
But it took some kind of foundational change, like a rough year, and it took a lot to get to that point.
So I think it was about 10 years ago, right? We had what we call our year from hell, which in previous sermons maybe you've heard share some about that, but it was really rough, right? That was a really, really hard year, and I think that opened up a chance for us to talk candidly about some stuff, but I think it opened up a lot for you on your journey. Can you tell us about that?
Like coming out of that, I don't really know why. But I had this question of like, essentially, where do I find femininity in God? I didn't word it that way. It was more like, I'm a woman and I know that I'm created in God's image, but I've only ever really, at that point, have heard masculine pronouns and masculine metaphors for God. So how does that work? Where do I find myself in God's image? So I reached out to my friend Theo.
Theo.
Love
We
Theo.
love Theo and Dan. They're amazing.
At the church that we were at.
Yep.
And asked her this question. And she sent me a recommendation for a book for Jesus Feminist by Sarah Bessey. And she was like, I don't know, this might be heresy, but this is like something worth reading. And it was pretty formative for me.
Yeah, I remember when you got that book, sort of like yellow cover. And I think I had heard a little bit about the book because I had worked with InterVarsity, and like there were women who were leaders, and was kind of familiar with it. But, you know, where we grew up, like feminism has this really kind of weighted, twisted connotation of being like really evil and sinister. And like I've grown to know that that's not true actually. But I think it raised in me some fears, right? As you were reading this book, my story included a lot of like fear and wondering and insecurity, because if you began to shift what you thought, like what would that mean for us? Right. Like what would that mean for us being committed to one another? Yeah.
So I don't remember if it was from this book or from a different book. Jesus Feminist basically got to the point of like, hey, women don't have the junior Holy Spirit.
Yep, you don't got an itty bitty one.
Like we have the same Holy Spirit that men do. And so if God gives us gifts or talents, we should use them for the church. And like, it's not up to any person to gatekeep what that looks like. But then at a certain point, we started to re-examine a particular passage in Ephesians chapter 5. So this is Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. This passage has often been used to keep women out of the church and keep women submissive in the home. And in some ways, it's easy to see why that might be. There are some translations that split these two verses apart. And so the second verse starts a new section. And I'll just read it. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Ugh. Okay, so that, like, on the surface, it seems open and shut case. Like, Paul is super clear, right? Yep. But if you look to the previous verse, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Well, in the Greek, the second submit, and like when Paul's telling wives to submit to their own husbands, that's borrowed from the first one.
Yeah,
it's implied.
Like, it's not in the sentence.
It's not in the sentence.
Right. If there's just one submit, and it's in both.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like submit to each other out of reverence for Christ, and then wives specifically to your own husbands, not just to anybody.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
which is very different than I think we were taught it in many spaces. Yeah.
And the foundation of that is that husbands and wives are submitting to each other. They're like, we're taking turns leading. We're taking turns submitting to each other.
Yeah, it's not like men are just off the hook, right? And like, you know, we don't have to submit to anyone, right? Like it's actually easy to do that, right? As a guy in particularly, but it's not what the scripture is teaching. It's teaching a story of oneness and of being together in fullness through submitting to one another in the way God does.
So then there's a part after this that is addressing men, husbands. And Paul says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word.
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea, like cleansing by washing. And you just sort of think about the culture of that day, right? And what would have been sort of gender norms is a lot of times like washing and caring for people was more of like a feminine thing, right? Like it was less aligned with what the guys should be doing and more aligned with what the women were expected to do. And so like, I just find it so fascinating.
Like women bathing children, like nurses bathing ill people. Like, I mean, these were traditionally, it was feminine work.
Yeah. But it's the invitation that like husbands are given here, right? It's not to just, you know, suddenly do all the things that were described as feminine, but like truly partner, right? Like be in this.
And be humans together.
Be humans. Yep. So maybe you, like us, have had some shifts in what you've thought about or something that you were taught when you were a kid. And I want you to just take a few minutes and turn to someone around you, talk about that, or take 90 seconds and put it in the chat.
So we were starting to re-examine some of our long-held beliefs, some of my long-held beliefs about roles within marriage. And at the same time, we were re-examining what we thought about women's roles in the church. And all of a sudden, something had shifted in my theology. And I just realized that if I had graduated with I did graduate with a degree in history, and if I had been a man, I would have wanted to be a pastor.
Yeah.
There was something in me that I learned as a child to adopt the desires, the sort of guidelines of whatever authority figures were in my life. It was a survival instinct.
Yeah, defense. Yeah.
So the whatever authority figure said was bad or evil, like my brain just I don't want it.
Yep.
Didn't even consider it. So when I realized this, I would have wanted to be a pastor. That was the first time that I really thought about it, that it even crossed my mind.
So you starting this journey of discovering and discerning what it would look like to be a pastor was really exciting for me in some regards. But there was also this really kind of deep-seated fear that this was kind of the start of a slippery slope of changing everything about the way that we interacted with each other. And I remember being pretty scared by it. Right?
Yeah.
But I also remember choosing to lean in and support you, right?
Right. And sometimes
it took some time.
Sometimes we had to fight a little bit to get there. Or I remember it took me 4 years to complete my degree.
All 90 credits, which is a lot.
My master's divinity. Yeah. And at the beginning of that time, I was reading a book and I was telling you about some concept in the book. And you were arguing with the concept.
Yeah, I kind of remember this. I think it was not very. I wish I could have gone back and told my younger self to be less scared.
We all have moments like that. I was really frustrated with the whole thing. I didn't have the words for it at the time, but looking back, I can see you were trying to take up space in my education.
Yeah.
And I really resisted that pretty hard.
So yeah, I think I was, right? I was injecting myself into what God was doing in your life because I think 2 reasons. One, I had grown so used to taking up space that I didn't even really realize when I was really encroaching on what your story is. But 2, I think I was also afraid, right, of where it would go, and I wanted to try to control it without controlling it.
Yeah.
Which is not not partnership.
Guide it.
Yes, I wanted to be a good shepherd, steward, or whatever it was. Whatever it was, it was not really loving and kind. I think that season reminds me of these trees.
Right.
Right. So when we were living in Greenville, I was working at a place. It was on 3rd Street, and when I would drive past these 2 trees, they would always stand out to me. There was a giant oak tree. It was gorgeous, right? It was huge canopy, really big trunk, had been thriving for a long time. And underneath it, there was this other tree that was it was desperately trying to, it was, growing sideways. It was kind of lopsided. It was trying to get to the sunlight. And that, I think it was just one tree was thriving, one wasn't. And I felt like that was this picture of us.
Yeah.
Right? We had moved cities to follow what God was doing for me. You had taken jobs to just support me to kind of make it through, and ones that worked with our family schedule and let me do the work I needed to do. And all of that ultimately led to this position of you not thriving and me thriving.
Yeah.
But it was also kind of beautiful on that same block, right? There was this other tree that was a magnolia tree and a red cedar tree that had somehow grown together. And, if you're just driving past 30, 40 miles an hour, you wouldn't really even notice.
Yeah.
So it was different.
I'm sure I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, probably not. But but when you slow down and take that closer look at it, you could see that it was actually 2 trees that trunks were so close together, and there were sections of magnolia leaves and sections of red cedar, and from a distance it looked like one tree, but these 2 trees were wrapped up in each other's thriving in some sort of really beautiful way. And that stark contrast was really interesting to me, and I think was a way that God was kind of showing me what it looked like to partner and to choose us versus functionally choosing myself.
Yeah. So our community was still having kind of a hard time wrapping their heads around what we were doing. I was taking most of my classes remotely, but I had to take 1/3 of my classes in person. And so I would drive from North Carolina to Kentucky. I'd be there for a week or a couple of long weekends.
Yeah. I would get all these compliments for letting you pursue an education.
Yeah, people would ask me, "Oh, where are the kids?" And I'd be like, "They're with their dad."
Right, right.
Oh, he's such a good guy. Nathan is so good to let you do that.
Yeah.
And I was
That's
like,
a really low bar.
we're giving out gold stars because he's letting me get an education. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you are a good guy. You were a good guy then, and you did bear a lot to make that happen. But also, like,
what was expected of us was so interesting and challenging. And I remember, I remember hearing those things and initially being like, you know what? I am a good guy. Right. It felt nice to be rewarded for that. But over time, I began to realize that like the praise of people doesn't mean it was good. Right. Like recognition doesn't mean it was actually right. Mm-hmm. So I think it started more of this internal journey for me. And as I heard more and more of those statements, like they became more and more frustrating. Right. Because I knew that it was built on a premise where you were being kind of crushed. Yeah. Right. And I remember I also began to be frustrated when like people would be like, "Oh, you're babysitting this weekend." I'm like, "No, that's incorrect.
No.
Have a great day." Right.
So we're in this community that like kind of got it, but a lot of them didn't. Yeah. I would tell them I was in seminary and they would be like, "For what?" Yeah. And I'd be like, "I'm going to be a pastor." And they're like, "What? But what kind of pastor?" And
children's
they just couldn't wrap their heads around me being a pastor. And so as I approached graduation, I graduated in May of 2020, which is a whole different story. But as I approached graduation, that winter in like December, we started talking about what our next steps were going to be. And I had a real sense that the church that we were at was not going to be the place that I would be able to grow as a leader, that I'd be able to take risks, that I'd be able to fail and learn from those risks. And so I had a pretty good sense I was going to have to find something else. And we were kind of faced with this fork in the road. Like I could get an appointment in a United Methodist church in rural nowhere, North Carolina, around where we lived. Or we could, look a little further afield and like go someplace else. And
I think one of the things that was so interesting about like the journey that you were on and we were on, right, is that it coincided with what I was feeling, right? That getting this impression, the sense that it was time for me to move on from the nonprofit I was working at the time. I was serving as executive director, and it wasn't be able to be a quick shift, but I was getting a sense that it was time to shift, right? Time to change. And that was easy to kind of bolster mentally too, because like pragmatically, right, like my skill set is wide enough, I could get a job wherever. And I think it started this conversation for us. So I remember like in that season, we decided that we were going to take some time and process this and pray and like ask for some guidance from some people that really knew us and loved us and understood where we really were. And I think it was a little bit of time, a couple of weeks, and that we decided we had a set time. We were going to go to the DAP House, which is a restaurant there in Greenville, and we were going to sit down and have this conversation to figure out what were our next steps.
Yeah. We're about to make a decision. Yeah. Right? So we're gonna tell people what happened, but we're gonna pause here on the cliffhanger, and we have a question for discussion. How do you make big decisions? Like, what's your process? Do you talk to other people? How do you prioritize different information? Take a minute and talk about it.
So picking up where we left off, right? Like we sat down. I don't remember what we ate. Like, I don't remember that. I do remember running into some friends right after, which is really interesting.
At the Kraft Nog place. The eggnog place.
Oh my gosh. Come on, Lansing. Get something like that. That'd be great. But no, it was really an interesting and beautiful conversation. I remember coming to the table, like having some clarity around what I feel like God had said. And I remember your response being like, what? But I felt like God said it was my turn to follow.
Yeah, that felt like a lot of responsibility. And also, like, knowing that you had a lot of marketable skills, a lot of experience. We both were pretty confident you would get a job. Yeah. Wherever, and maybe it wouldn't be your dream job, but you'd be able to get a job that worked well for you. And since at the time I wasn't pursuing being in a United Methodist church, I was looking at non-denominational churches, it was going to be tough for me to get a job in that space. And ultimately that's how we wound up at Chicago for a couple of years.
Yeah. And I absolutely like loved being in Chicago, but I also think like our journey to Lansing too was a continuation of like what it meant for me to be choosing us, was really in this season to continue to be following you and knowing that God's got stuff for me, right? And like that's going to come together and that's fine. But it was also interesting. It wasn't like a one-time decision of like, all right, following Mikkel, everything's smooth sailing, right? Like that is so far from true. I remember a number of times like I had to continue to lean into choosing us and ask myself, what does it look like to actually take up the right amount of space in our marriage, right? Not take up more than I had for so long and make you kind of live in my shadow.
And then there's been continue to be times where like my theology was shifting and you weren't quite there yet, and you had like a fear response, but then had to work through it, and we made it on the other side. 18 years later, like we've been married for 18 years, and I'm really thankful that we're so different than we were.
Yes.
And I'm really glad that we've grown and changed in similar directions. And
I'm incredibly thankful for that too. Like I think both of us like have witnessed when one person is growing into a greater clarity of who God's made them to be, and like their original partner like isn't joining them, right? And like isn't on that journey, and that's really, really hard to watch someone go through and recognize that like sometimes really hard choices have to be made, and like, and
as holy as marriage is, it isn't the end all be all,
right?
And if you're in a relationship where your partner isn't choosing the partnership, then like sometimes
I think that there's like sufficient love and grace for that.
I think for us, like choosing partnership, choosing us has often looked like making space for us to just be human.
Yeah.
Like I am a pastor, and I am a sister, and I am a mother, and I am a friend, I am a wife. But underneath all of that,
and you love to garden, and
underneath all of that, I'm a human.
Yep.
And that matters. And you're a human apart from me, and that matters. And so like trying to figure out how to honor each other's personalities and backgrounds.
Different as we are, right?
Right.
So I've really enjoyed this phrase that we've been using of what does it mean for us to come home to ourselves, right? And like truly believing that we were created by a good God, and we were created good, and a lot of these desires that we have, right, are true to our core. And I think this process of discovering that and rediscovering that has been really, really good, and to lean into that for both of us. So I'm excited for like what the future holds and what that looks like. But choosing us has not been easy.
No.
Right.
But it has been good.
Absolutely has been good.
We're talking about partnership, choosing partnership. We know that not everybody watching this is in a partnered relationship. Not everybody is married or wants to be married.
Yeah.
What would you say is like a takeaway from our story that might apply to anybody?
Yeah. I think the takeaway from my sort of vantage point within our story is I think it's really critical that we ask ourselves the hard questions about how much space are we taking up, right? And specifically for like people who've typically held power, right? Like white men, right? Like how am I asking am I taking up too much space? Am I taking up space I shouldn't? Like, am I filling voids or vacuums where other leaders are meant to be stepping forward? And am I actually truncating people's development because of that? I think there's something like a question I need to ask myself about that. It's hard, right? Like pruning is not very fun. I mean, like making yourself smaller is not really fun. So, but I think that question, while sometimes might feel like death, on the other side of it, I think is much more satisfying and fulfilling type of life.
And I would say, for those who have traditionally taken up less space, like sometimes you just like, you need to know that you matter.
Yes.
That your desires, your thoughts, your perspectives matter. And it's not selfish to ask for those to be part of the conversation and to say, if our thriving is tied up in each other, this is what it means for me to thrive. This is what it means for me to be a whole human.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, who are you underneath all the
Yep.
ties and the things that are pulling on you? Who does God say you are, and how can you be more of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we both fully agree that like we're all better when we're the most sort of fully understood and loved versions of ourselves. And that
Yeah.
starts with kind of knowing ourselves and
Yeah.
bringing ourselves to the table.
Yeah.
So let's get there. Blink. I waited for a fade out. I tried not to move. The end.
And
Elfine. Right? That would be great, right? Just like, it's like, you know, like the old movie roll, 35 millimeter or whatever, like whatever.